Imani Carter was just trying to graduate until Harvard labeled her a threat. At 2 a.m., they found her in a locked archive room, clutching a file they said didn't exist. Campus security dragged her out like a criminal, but she only said 6 words. I needed to know the truth. What she uncovered. It had been buried for 63 years. And now, the university wants her silence. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below.
The clock on the wall read.
Inside the modest but well-appointed apartment, overlooking Harvard Yard, Douglas Whitmore, Director of Student Affairs, rubbed his eyes and stared at the email that had just pinged on his laptop. The subject line read, Unauthorized Access Alert, 2C Library Archives. At first he thought it was a glitch. Those alerts sometimes triggered when faculty forgot to log their access codes properly. But this time, the system had flagged a unique ID, an undergraduate student keycard. He frowned. Students weren't allowed anywhere near the archives without explicit faculty oversight, and certainly not past midnight. Protocol required security to handle it. But something about this made him throw on his coat and head out. He didn't know why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was guilt. The night outside was cool and quiet, the kind of eerie silence only Ivy League campuses seem to carry after dark. The stone walkways shimmered faintly from an earlier drizzle. The old lamps lining the path gave off a dull orange glow, casting long shadows that danced over the grass. Whitmore's footsteps echoed louder than he expected as he approached 2C Library. He glanced up at the Gothic architecture, still a bit surreal to him even after 16 years working here. He keyed in his access code. The heavy door gave a reluctant groan as it opened. Inside, it was colder. He made his way past reading rooms and through restricted corridors, his shoes thudding on polished stone, down the narrow staircase to the archives. The motion sensor lights flickered on one by one, like the hallway itself was waking up. And then he saw her, a young black girl, maybe 18 or 19, stood alone in the far end of the archival room, hunched over an old wooden table. Her curls were pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore a gray Harvard sweatshirt 2 sizes too big. Her hands were shaking, clutching a thin, weathered manila file. Whitmore froze. She hadn't noticed him yet. She seemed consumed, as if the papers in front of her carried more weight than she could hold. Excuse me, he called out, his voice echoing through the room. You're not supposed to be here. The girl didn't flinch. She turned slowly, almost defiantly as if she'd rehearsed this moment. Her eyes were sharp, wet but unyielding. Pain lived behind them. Deep, historic pain. Name, he said, stepping closer. Imani Carter, she replied, her voice calm. Too calm. His heart sank. He knew the name. Freshman. Public policy major. Honor scholarship. He'd spoken at her orientation. It took him a moment to connect the dots. What are you doing here, Miss Carter? He asked, though his eyes were already narrowing toward the folder in her hand. No student accessed files directly like that. Not without help, and certainly not these kinds of files. The off-limits kind, the ones the university had quietly relocated to the sensitive materials section after the 1985 controversy. I needed to see it for myself, Imani said, holding the folder tighter. Before he could respond, the door creaked open behind him. 2 campus officers stepped in, 1 male, 1 female, both clearly uncomfortable with the call they'd received. One of them glanced at Whitmore for direction. She's a student, Whitmore said, though his voice was clipped. She shouldn't be here. She accessed a locked section unauthorized. The officers nodded, moving slowly toward Imani, hands hovering near their belts, not weapons drawn, but posture ready. Imani didn't run, didn't argue. She simply turned the folder over in her hands and looked Whitmore dead in the eye. I needed to know the truth, she said again. The words hung in the air like gunpowder. The officers gently took the folder from her and guided her toward the door. Her steps were slow, composed, almost regal. Whitmore watched, disturbed by the unshaken dignity in her silence. Once she was gone, the officers out of sight, Whitmore turned toward the table. The folder was still open. Half of its contents had spilled across the wood. He flipped through them, expecting old alumni records, maybe historic documents. Nothing controversial. But as he began to read, the breath left his lungs. There were disciplinary memos from 1962. A formal expulsion letter. Handwritten notes about a student named Eleanor Carter. One sentence in particular stabbed through the quiet like a scream. This university cannot be held hostage to racial agitation disguised as academic pursuit. He froze. The name, the phrasing, the date. Eleanor Carter. His eyes darted to the family name. Carter. He looked again at the door Imani had been taken through. The pieces were clicking into place, and what they formed wasn't just history. It was a scandal that could unravel the pristine threads of Harvard's self-mythology. There were more files. Photographs. Scanned letters. Stamped reports. One paper had a red ink note scribbled in the margin. Destroy before digitizing. Whitmore's fingers trembled. This wasn't a student trying to steal. This was a student uncovering a truth Harvard had buried. But how had she found it? Why had she gone looking in the first place? And more urgently, how far had she already spread what she found? He looked back down at the file and turned to the last page. A single name was circled. His own. Whitmore's own name was on a list labeled Institutional Continuity, Descendants of 1962 Action Committee. 2 months before the 2 a.m. incident, the air in Harvard Yard was alive with possibility. Late August sun filtered through the trees as new students arrived, each trailing behind luggage, parents and dreams thick with promise. Among them was Imani Carter, 19 years old, straight out of Southside Chicago, walking into the oldest university in America, with her mother's borrowed suitcase and a full-ride scholarship bearing the name of a man who'd once owned slaves. Her arrival was quiet. No fanfare, no legacy portrait waiting in the alumni hall. Just her dressed in faded jeans, and a hopeful smile, stepping onto campus like she belonged. She did. Her transcript was flawless, her essays fierce, her interviews unforgettable. She had earned every inch of that ground. But belonging and being seen as belonging were two different things. Within minutes of arriving, Imani noticed the subtle pauses, the glances that lingered half a second too long. A girl in salmon-colored vineyard vines shorts asked if she was a recruit for track. A boy with slicked-back hair, his Harvard lanyard already swinging from his neck like a medal, smirked and said, "Let me guess, pre-med or sociology." "I'm public policy," Imani replied, unfazed. She had trained for this her whole life. Still, it started to chip at her. Not with hammers but with needles. Orientation was a blur of panels, mixers and information overload. The head of residential life gave a speech about diversity that sounded like a TED Talk written by ChatGPT. Students were encouraged to celebrate differences and engage in difficult conversations, but the only ones who actually spoke to Imani seemed either fascinated or performatively woke. "Where are you from?" "Chicago." "Oh, like the West Side?" "No, South." "Oh wow. That's brave of you." Brave, she thought, as if survival was a personality trait. Her dorm was in Strauss Hall, a red brick colonial left over from the 1920s. The room was small, with twin beds and matching lamps. Her roommate arrived an hour after she did, wheeling in coordinated luggage and escorted by 2 men in suits. One of them shook hands with the dean in the hallway. Madeline Burke. Blonde, sharp-featured and effortlessly confident. She introduced herself with a dry smile and a handshake that felt like a business deal. "My dad's on the board," she said within 5 minutes of meeting Imani. "But I'm not like those legacy kids." Imani just nodded. She'd learned early that smiling was safer than arguing. Their interactions were cordial, but distant. Madeline never asked about Imani's life back home, her family, or why she kept a framed photo of a woman no one else recognized. Eleanor Carter, her grandmother's older sister, whom her family rarely discussed but always honored. Classes began the following Monday. Imani walked into her Public Policy 101 course wearing a neatly pressed shirt and a backpack filled with fresh highlighters. She chose a seat near the front, not out of arrogance but because it helped her focus. Professor Albert Driscoll, a tenured name in policy reform circles, scanned the room and gave a nod. His eyes flickered across her and kept moving. The class began. Imani raised her hand during the first discussion on the welfare state. Driscoll didn't call on her. A white student offered a less precise point and got acknowledged. The same thing happened 2 days later. By week 3, Imani had built a quiet map of who was seen and who wasn't. She spoke with clarity and depth when given the chance, but each time she did, Driscoll would blink, surprised, as if hearing her speak well broke some internal calibration. "Excellent insight, Miss Carter," he said once, sounding shocked. "Really didn't expect that angle." She let it go. The first time. Then came the writing assignment. A 5-page analysis on education funding. Imani poured herself into it. Research, structure, statistics, personal insight. She submitted it early. When she got it back, the grade was an A-, but the note in red marker at the top read, "Did you receive assistance with this essay? Consider reworking in your own voice." She stared at the comment for a long time. Assistance? She'd written every word. Alone. In the library. Across several late nights. After class, she asked Driscoll for clarification. "It's just," he said, shifting in his chair. "It reads almost professionally, beyond what I'd expect at the undergrad level. I'm not accusing you, just double-checking." Double-checking. A euphemism with 1,000 implications. She didn't cry. Not in front of him. That night, in her room, she stared at her laptop and pulled up the Harvard application portal. Out of curiosity and some gnawing instinct, she clicked on her admissions documents. There it was, in an internal review note. Essay strength unusually high. Flagged for possible external editing. No action taken. Flagged. For writing too well. She scrolled down further. There were no such notes on Madeline's file. Not that she expected there to be. Imani shut her laptop and stared at the ceiling. Everything she had feared about this place, about being seen as an exception, rather than an equal, wasn't paranoia, it was policy. Quiet, polished, institutional. She thought about calling her mom, but what would she say? "They think I don't belong here because I sound smarter than they expected." It sounded petty, but it wasn't. It was the weight of being excellent, and still being doubted. That week, Madeline came in with a package from her father. She tossed it on the bed and said, "He says the student paper's doing a piece on legacy kids. Wants to know if I'm okay being quoted." "Good for you," Imani replied. "You know," Madeline said, hesitating, "you should write about your story. Make it your brand. You're kind of like a diversity unicorn." Imani didn't respond. She didn't trust herself to. Instead, she opened her backpack, pulled out Eleanor Carter's photo, and placed it on the desk again. She whispered, "I hope you see this. I hope you know I'm trying." But even Eleanor's smile couldn't calm the storm in her chest. The next day, Imani receives a sealed envelope from the admissions office. Inside, a formal notice that her essay is being reviewed for academic integrity violation. The envelope sat on Imani's desk for 3 days before she opened it. By then, her appetite had faded, her trust in the system corroded. The formal tone of the notice inside, words like further review, plagiarism, algorithm, pending faculty board approval, confirmed what she already knew. The university didn't see her as a student with promise. It saw her as a possible mistake, a fluke, a problem. She didn't sleep much that week, but she did what she always did. She worked, studied harder, smiled more carefully, nodded in class, nodded at people who never nodded back. So when the flyer for Harvard's undergraduate research initiative came across her inbox, she applied the same night. It was a long shot, but it came with access to departments under faculty supervision, to archived records not available to the public, and most importantly, to a space where she might reclaim a version of herself, not framed in suspicion. 3 weeks later, she got the position. She was assigned as a research assistant in the university's archival program, specifically under Dr. Ronald Bishop, a professor of historical anthropology with a soft voice, wine-colored glasses, and the cautious air of someone who'd seen reputations break in slow motion. He welcomed her with a kind smile and a large set of keys. "I'll have you helping with document categorization," he explained. "Old correspondences, dusty boxes no one's opened in years. It's mostly boring work, but it matters." Boring was fine. Boring didn't judge her for writing well. The archive was located beneath Widener Library. Long corridors, flickering lights, and the sterile scent of paper aging in silence. The deeper sections of the basement were humid and unpolished. Metal racks sagged under the weight of forgotten records. Her first week was uneventful. She categorized post-war admissions letters, yellowed faculty notes, donation ledgers. She found a rhythm in it, quiet, methodical, free from judgment. But on the 7th day, as she was shelving files marked Class of 1963, she noticed a strange door tucked behind a large mobile shelf, half obscured. It wasn't labeled. The key didn't work. She asked Dr. Bishop about it casually. "Storage overflow," he said too quickly. "Nothing you'll need to worry about." But that was a lie. She could hear it in his voice. The slight pause, the way he wouldn't meet her eyes. People lie differently when they believe they're protecting something. Later that afternoon, while waiting by the copier, she heard him in the next room. The walls in the archive were thin. "I told you, it's not accessible," he whispered. "Yes, I know what's in there. But we don't open those files without committee approval."
Pause.
"No, not even with that name." That name. Imani felt her skin tighten. She moved closer, careful not to make a sound. Another voice, sharper, impatient, replied, "It's part of the 1962 set. They're calling it the Carter Legacy. The student made a connection. If she finds it, we'll have a problem." A beat, then Dr. Bishop. "We should have destroyed that folder when the digitization started." That night, Imani searched every digital database she had access to. Nothing came up under Carter Legacy. She widened the search. No Eleanor Carter. No expulsion. No references in student newspapers. No archived student photos. Just a gap. A hollow space, where a student once was. Imani lay awake in bed, her laptop glowing in the dark, her heart pounding. Could it be? Could the Eleanor Carter her family whispered about, the one her grandmother cried over in silence, have been at Harvard? She called her mother the next morning. Did Grandma ever talk about Eleanor going to college? There was a long silence. "She went," her mother said eventually. "Harvard, I think." But she didn't finish. "Something happened. Grandma never told us. Just said she came back different. Quiet. Angry." Imani's breath caught. She didn't mention the archive. Not yet. Back in the basement the next day, she approached the sealed door again. This time she knelt and looked closely at the hinges. There was no visible lock, just a magnetic keycard panel with a dead light, the kind of access reserved for senior archivists or administrators. She didn't ask Dr. Bishop again. Instead, she watched. On Friday evening, as the building began to empty, she waited until Bishop left early. She slipped back downstairs, bypassed the camera angle she'd memorized, and crept toward the door with one goal in mind: getting in. She had no plan, no keycard, just instinct and desperation. Then, unexpectedly, a cleaning cart rolled down the hall. The janitor was humming a quiet tune, pushing the cart past the rows of shelves. Imani stood still, heart racing. The janitor paused at the corner, glanced at her, and offered a faint smile. "You still here?" he asked. "Yeah," she lied. "Last-minute filing." He nodded and continued down the hallway. She looked down at the cart. A set of access keycards hung from the side, worn but likely active. She hesitated. Everything in her body said, don't risk it. Don't be the stereotype. Don't be what they already suspect you are." But what if this was her story too? What if everything they'd buried was her inheritance? She took the card, swiped it. The door beeped, unlocked. It creaked open with a slow, mechanical groan. Inside was no ordinary storage room. It was colder, dimly lit. Boxes lined the walls, labeled with handwritten tags in fading marker. Some were sealed with red wax. Others looked half-opened, as if hastily abandoned mid-review. In the center of the room sat a metal cabinet with 3 large drawers. She opened the top drawer, faculty communications. The second, disciplinary records. Her hands trembled as she opened the third. A single folder sat inside. The Carter Legacy. She pulled it out, holding it like something sacred. It wasn't thick, but it was heavy with implication. She felt it in her chest. She turned to leave, and found herself face to face with Director Douglas Whitmore, standing silently in the doorway, eyes locked on the folder in her hand. The room fell into a silence thick enough to choke on. Director Douglas Whitmore didn't speak immediately. He stood in the doorway like a shadow stitched to the past, his eyes flicking between Imani and the folder she clutched against her chest. The yellowing manila paper seemed to pulse with weight in her hands. "I should report you," he said finally, his voice a low mix of weariness and warning. Imani didn't blink. "Do it," she whispered. "But I'm not the one Harvard buried." Whitmore didn't answer. He stepped aside, just slightly enough to let her pass. She moved quickly, brushing past him without making eye contact, holding the file tight to her ribs. He didn't follow her. He didn't have to. His silence said everything. Back in her dorm, with the door locked and the lights off, Imani opened the file on her desk like she was unwrapping something sacred and haunted. The first page was a student profile. Name: Eleanor Marie Carter. Admission year: hometown Atlanta, Georgia. Major: government. The black and white photo clipped to the corner showed a young woman with high cheekbones, natural hair pulled into a bun, and eyes that looked directly into the camera with quiet defiance. Imani felt her throat tighten. She looked like her grandmother. As she flipped through the pages, the narrative began to unfold, slow and suffocating. Eleanor had entered Harvard during one of its most turbulent years. While the administration publicly boasted of diversifying its student body, internally, they'd been divided. Eleanor had been one of just 3 black women admitted that year. Unlike the others, she had no political family ties, no wealthy patrons. She came on merit and activism. Imani read Eleanor's first warning letter, dated October. Miss Carter is encouraged to refrain from participating in unauthorized campus demonstrations. Her presence at the October 4th protest outside the law school is noted in violation of student conduct standards. The protest had been about faculty segregation, black custodial workers being excluded from staff gatherings. Eleanor had helped organize it. 3 weeks later, a second letter, this time plagiarism allegation. An anonymous report claimed Eleanor's midterm essay on constitutional disobedience and civil rights bore similarities to a previously published law journal. The folder included no official comparison, no hearing transcript, just the accusation, and then a summary dismissal. Imani could barely breathe as she turned the page. A formal letter, stamped with the university seal. Effective November 15, 1962. Eleanor Carter is hereby expelled from Harvard University for violation of academic integrity standards. No appeal, no recorded defense. The final memo was handwritten, unsigned, dated 3 days before her expulsion. It read, EC remains defiant, uncooperative, unwilling to compromise. Final recommendation. Silence her before the media smells blood. Imani stared at the line until her vision blurred. She flipped back through the file looking for anything, any evidence of process, of fairness. There was none, just notes, administrative codes, phrases like optics, reputational risk, and radical behavior. One document caught her eye, a student complaint filed against Eleanor, not by a professor. Filed by Madeline Burke, class of 19. The name hit her like ice water. Madeline Burke, the same name as her current roommate. Her heart skipped. It had to be coincidence, right? But her roommate had mentioned her family went way back at Harvard. Could this be her grandmother? Or worse, her mother? The letter accused Eleanor of aggressive behavior in discussion, and making other students uncomfortable with inflammatory opinions on race. Imani set the file down, her hands trembling. The institutional machinery hadn't just expelled Eleanor. They'd erased her. There were no public records, no student memorial, no mention in the university archives. She had been scrubbed from Harvard's history like an unwanted footnote. And now, decades later, her own great-niece had been flagged for the same accusation. Plagiarism. Imani sank back into her chair. She understood now. This wasn't just about her paper. It was about legacy, not hers, but Harvard's. It had long memories and short ethics. She pulled out her phone and called her mother again. I found her, Imani said. Her mother didn't answer right away. Then softly, your grandmother said Eleanor came home and never spoke about it again. She stopped talking about school altogether. Started working in a community center. Got sick, young. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? Imani asked. Because it hurt too much. And because we were told to move on. To be quiet. We survived by not making noise. Imani hung up and stared at Eleanor's face again. She was done being quiet. But Harvard wasn't done with her. The next morning, she returned from class to find a plain white envelope, slipped under her dorm door. No name, no return address. Inside was a single note, typed, "Stop digging or you'll regret it." No punctuation, no signature. Just the chill of old power waking up. That night she found her dorm keycard access revoked, and her campus email locked out without explanation. It began with a look. The kind that hovered just a second too long. Eyes flicking from Imani to someone else, then back again, followed by a whisper too quiet to catch and a smile too polite to trust. By the end of the week it wasn't just glances. It was avoidance. It was the way people who once nodded at her in hallways suddenly had urgent text to read. The way her dorm hall fell quieter when she entered the common room. She knew something had shifted. The white envelope from under her door had already chilled her to the bone. But this social rot, felt different. More surgical, like the institution had decided not just to erase her, but to isolate her first. Madeline Burke confirmed it 2 days later. It was late. The room was dim. Imani sat at her desk scrolling through Eleanor's scanned documents, trying to figure out what had triggered the warning. She'd just finished marking a particularly brutal memo when Madeline walked in and dropped her bag a little louder than usual. "Can we talk?" she said flatly. Imani turned. Madeline stood stiff, arms crossed, her tone clipped. "I don't know what game you're playing," she started, "but it's making people uncomfortable." Imani blinked. "Excuse me? The whole campus is buzzing. You broke into a locked archive. You're posting things online, half-truths, personal files. Now you're accusing the university of covering up, what, racism from the 60s. It's not an accusation if it happened," Imani said evenly. Madeline scoffed. "People here have worked their entire lives to be part of this place. And you're walking around acting like you're the only one who's ever faced hardship. It's exhausting." There it was, the mask off. "I'm not walking around acting like anything," Imani said. "I found evidence of a historical injustice, one that connects to me personally. Why does that threaten you?" Madeline didn't answer, but the tension in her jaw said enough. That night, Imani couldn't sleep. Her mind kept circling back to the Burke name in Eleanor's file. Was it a coincidence? Or was Madeline's defensiveness rooted in something deeper, something inherited? The next morning, she checked her campus profile, still locked out. Then came the Reddit thread. A friend from back home texted her a screenshot. "Arn Harvard confessions. Affirmative action princess exposes Harvard for clout." The post featured a blurred photo of Imani near the library, and an anonymous rant claiming she was using race to rewrite history, that she was disrespecting the institution, and had forged her narrative for social media fame. The upvotes were brutal. The comments were worse. "Why is she even here? This is why merit should matter." Another DI experiment gone wrong. Imani sat on the edge of her bed, phone trembling in her hand, eyes burning. She hadn't even posted anything publicly yet. The file had never left her room. But someone, maybe Bishop, maybe Whitmore, had leaked the fact that she accessed it, and the university's internal machine had done the rest. Her study group stopped replying to her texts. Professor Driscoll avoided her gaze during lectures. When she raised her hand, he no longer even acknowledged it. By Thursday, her advisor, Dean Hollis, called her in for a wellness check. He smiled too much during the meeting, speaking in that administrative tone that always felt just slightly too pleasant to be honest. "I'm hearing some concerns," he said. "Just murmurs. Students feeling a little unsettled. Faculty unsure how to handle the situation." "What situation?" Imani asked. He folded his hands. "Imani, I just want you to stay focused on your academics. You're here to learn, to grow, not stir controversy." She looked at him stunned. "So digging into a wrongful expulsion connected to my family supported by actual university records isn't academic?" He didn't answer, just leaned back and said, "Harvard's a delicate place. History isn't always meant to be reopened. Not everything is personal." But for her, everything was personal now. She left his office with her heart thudding, the walls closing in around her. The next day, the silence was louder than ever. Even in the dining hall, she could feel people watching her. As if she were a storm no one wanted to stand near. Conversations died when she approached tables. Her tray clattered alone on an empty section of the table. By now she could read the university like a machine. Polite on the surface, punishing underneath. It didn't come for you with hands. It came for you with system. That evening, she returned to her dorm to find a red slip taped to her door. Office of Student Conduct. Immediate appearance required. Subject unauthorized entry. Archive level 3. As she peeled the notice off the door, her phone buzzed with a blocked call. And when she answered, a voice whispered, "You think you're the first Carter they tried to silence." The hearing wasn't a hearing. Not really. Imani sat in a beige room, with frosted glass windows, and a laminated placard that read Office of Community Standards. Across the table, 2 administrators and a legal affairs officer reviewed a packet of documents. Not one of them looked at her. The charges were clear: unauthorized access to restricted university property, violation of archival security protocols, and conduct unbecoming of a Harvard student. But the truth, the real truth, was not on the table. Imani waited for someone to ask her why she'd gone into the archives, why she'd risked everything to find Eleanor Carter's file, why a young black woman would feel compelled to dig into history no one wanted to remember. No one asked. "Ms. Carter," the lead administrator finally said, flipping to the final page of the packet, You understand that accessing a sealed archive room, especially without approved credentials, violates our policy. Do you dispute that you entered the restricted area? No, Imani said. I entered. But then the facts are not in dispute, he interrupted. But they're incomplete, she pushed. I went in because I found evidence of a former black student, Eleanor Carter, who was expelled under false pretenses in 1962. I have documents. She was erased because she spoke out against racism on campus. She's my great aunt. A silence settled over the room. The legal officer adjusted his tie. That chapter is closed, the administrator said finally. The institution has evolved since then. Evolved. A neat word to paper over decades of systemic harm. You're punishing me for seeking truth, Imani said, leaning forward. But not one person has asked why Eleanor was targeted. Not one. We're here to address your conduct, not to relitigate university history. The administrator said. Our focus is present-day standards. She looked each of them in the eye. Then the present hasn't changed much, has it? No one responded.
The meeting adjourned without a resolution.
A formal decision would be emailed within 10 business days. Imani walked out into the sunlight that suddenly felt too harsh, too public. As she passed through Harvard Yard, the buildings, once symbols of prestige, now loomed like silent judges. Their stones held secrets, and none of them were on her side. Back in her dorm, she turned to the only tool she still had, her words. She reached out to the Harvard Crimson, the student newspaper. She asked to speak with an editor about running a story, one that included Eleanor Carter's erasure, the disciplinary file, and the retaliation she now faced. The editor, a junior political science major named Liam Chang, responded 2 days later with a message that felt oddly rehearsed. Appreciate your passion, he wrote. But without corroborating public records on Eleanor Carter, it's a tough pitch. We try to avoid unverified historical allegations. Hope you understand. Imani replied with scanned copies of the documents. She even attached a photo of the expulsion letter. No answer. She followed up. Still no answer. When she finally caught Liam outside the dining hall, he gave her a quick apologetic shrug. It's not just me, he said, his voice low. There are concerns. Higher up. Pressure not to stir controversy. Especially tied to old disciplinary stuff. Concerns from who? She asked. But he was already turning away. Nini returned to her room and opened a new Google Doc. This time, she would write the story herself. She typed until her fingers ached. Every detail, every piece of evidence, every coded silence. She uploaded redacted copies of the archival file, screenshots of her locked campus access, even a timeline of events. It wasn't polished. It wasn't refined. But it was real. She emailed it to herself. Saved backups, printed a copy. If they were going to bury her, she'd leave a trail. Still, the loneliness grew heavier. Madeline no longer acknowledged her. Her professors seemed to look through her, like she'd become a ghost haunting their syllabus. Only Dr. Julian Hayes from African American Studies had quietly slid her a note in class. Keep receipts. Institutions count on silence. That night, as she reviewed her documents one more time, a ping hit her inbox. It was from an anonymous Gmail address. No subject line, no text, just one attachment. Imani clicked. It was a scanned photo, grainy, black and white. It showed a young woman being dragged down the stone steps of Harvard's administrative hall by 2 police officers. Her face was half turned, mouth open in protest, one shoe missing. It was Eleanor Carter. Imani recognized her immediately. But this photo was never part of the archived file. On the back, handwritten in red ink. They made sure no one saw this. Now you have. 10 minutes later, her printer started whirring on its own, spitting out page after page. On the final one, a list of names, including hers. The air in Harvard Yard didn't shift, but Imani could feel it. An invisible turn. It was like the school itself had gone still, watching her with narrowed eyes, waiting to decide what punishment she deserved for daring to dig into the bones beneath its marble skin. She woke up to find the silence sharper. Emails stopped arriving. Group chats dried up. Even her professors, those who once praised her writing and offered her quiet smiles of encouragement, had gone mute. The few who did speak to her chose their words like they'd been coached.
Then came the noise.
A ping from a fellow student, Leah, arrived mid-afternoon. No text, just an audio file. Listen in private, Leah wrote. Imani locked her dorm room, plugged in her earbuds, and hit play. It was a recording low, crackling, like it had been captured from under a coat or behind a closed door. The voices were unmistakably polished, male, authoritative. "I don't care how well she writes," one voice said sharply. "She's not the kind of story we want associated with the school." Imani felt her blood run cold. She recognized the voice. It belonged to Randall Burke, a Harvard trustee and her roommate Madeline's father. Another man responded. "She's destabilizing things, turning students into activists. This isn't Oberlin." Burke again. "This is Harvard. We've survived wars, protests, integration and scandal. We'll survive her." The final line was barely above a whisper. "If we can't silence her academically, we'll make her question whether she belongs here at all." The audio clicked off. Imani stared at the wall, then at her phone, then at the photo of Imani Carter taped beside her desk. There was no pretending anymore. This wasn't just discomfort. This was war. She rushed across campus to the Student Financial Services office, her chest tight. The receptionist, a cheerful grad student, who'd once joked with her about vending machine snacks, looked up with unfamiliar formality. "I'm here to ask about my grant status," Imani said. "There's been a mistake." The woman pulled up her file, scrolled, frowned. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "Your funding is currently under administrative review pending disciplinary outcomes." "What disciplinary outcomes?" Imani asked, though she already knew. "Ma'am, I'm not allowed to disclose further details." "Ma'am." That was new too. Next stop, the archives office. She marched down to the dim halls of Widener Library, where she'd once found sanctuary in the rows of aged paper and forgotten names. But Dr. Bishop's door was locked. A printed sign read, "Office closed, until further notice. Professor on leave." A colleague emerged nearby, and Imani intercepted him. "Do you know when Dr. Bishop will be back?" He paused, giving her a look that almost carried pity. "He's not returning this semester." But he didn't say goodbye. "Imani," the man said softly, "just take care of yourself, all right?" Her breath caught in her throat. They hadn't just removed her from the project. They'd shut the whole thing down, buried it. Again. That evening, her inbox pinged again. Subject: immediate revocation of research assistantship. Due to ongoing reputational risk associated with your conduct and social media activity, your role in the Historical Documentation Initiative has been terminated effective immediately. Your access credentials will be disabled within 24.
No one said the word fired.
Harvard never did things that directly, but the result was the same. Imani sat on the edge of her bed, hands trembling, staring at the termination notice. The message wasn't just professional. It was personal. It was clear. You are not welcome here anymore. Later that night, in the dining hall, whispers spread like smoke. That's the girl who hacked the archives. She's suing the school. No, I heard she's related to a Black Panther. She just wants attention. Typical diversity hire. Imani ate in silence. Madeline passed her on the way out without a glance. Not even a flicker of recognition. The final straw came just before 8. Her phone buzzed with a news alert from a blog that catered to Ivy League alumni. The headline read, "Harvard student under fire for espionage-level breach. Trustees concerned about radical alumni ties." The article included a blurry photo of her leaving the archives, painted her as a destabilizing figure in the classroom, and suggested disciplinary action may not be enough to contain future liabilities. Future liabilities. That's what she was now. Not a student. A threat. The world felt smaller and louder. The walls were closing in. She left the dining hall without finishing her meal and headed for the main courtyard. Walking fast, head down. But before she made it out the door, a tall figure approached. Dr. Julian Hayes, her professor from African American Studies. He didn't greet her, just slipped a folded piece of paper onto her tray. "Read it. Burn it," he said, "and come where truth still breathes." She stared at the paper as he disappeared into the crowd. Back in her dorm, she unfolded the note. "The Crossing Cafe. 9 p.m. Come alone. I have something you need to see." As she stood to leave, her dorm light flickered, then cut out entirely. Her laptop shut down. Her phone screen turned black, then flashed with a single line. "Some truths stay buried for a reason." The Crossing Cafe sat just outside Harvard Square, half hidden between a bookstore and a brick-walled florist. It wasn't a place students frequented, much too quiet, too old school. But on that night, with the air heavy and the weight of surveillance pressing against her skin, it felt like neutral ground. Imani stepped inside at exactly 9:09 p.m. The cafe was nearly empty, its wood-paneled walls dimly lit by old brass sconces. She spotted Dr. Julian Hayes in the back corner, wearing a gray coat and the same unreadable expression he wore in lectures. His wire-rimmed glasses reflected the soft light, making his eyes hard to read. He didn't rise when she approached, just gestured silently for her to sit. "I figured it wouldn't be long before they came after you," he said, voice low but calm. Imani sat down cautiously. "Why me?" "Because you touched what wasn't meant to be touched," he said, sliding a leather-bound folder across the table. "This university was built on selective memory. You broke that." She opened the folder slowly. Inside were scanned copies of typewritten memos, marked confidential, stamped property of Harvard trustees. Each page was a layer deeper into the corruption she had only begun to understand. The first memo detailed a faculty meeting in October 1962, following Eleanor Carter's attendance at a protest against segregated housing policies. The language was sterile but damning. "Miss Carter's presence on campus continues to draw attention to ideological divisions. Her refusal to remain apolitical presents reputational risk. Faculty are advised to lower engagement and monitor her academic submissions for irregularities." A second memo dated 2 weeks later. "Faculty notes suggest Miss Carter's midterm paper exceeds expected levels of development. Consider initiating plagiarism review. Coordinate with Dean Rutherford and admissions liaison before proceeding." Imani read the line 3 times. It was never about plagiarism. It was sabotage. Systematic, premeditated, academic gaslighting institutionalized on paper. "She never stood a chance," Imani whispered, throat tight. "None of them did," Hayes said. Eleanor was one of 6 black students that year. 3 left by the end of the term. The rest kept their heads down. One went on to become a judge in Detroit, but Eleanor pushed too hard. Did she know she was being targeted? She figured it out. But by then, the machine had already turned against her. Imani ran her fingers over the edge of the folder. "What happened to the people behind this?" she asked. Hayes sighed. "Most retired quietly. A few became household names. Their families now donate buildings, fund scholarships, name lecture halls. It's generational, self-sustaining." She closed the folder. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because it's still happening," he said, "to you. And because silence makes me complicit." She looked at him closely, unsure whether to trust this sudden ally. "Why now?" He held her gaze. "Because you're not asking for revenge. You're asking for truth. And if anyone deserves to break that silence, it's a Carter." She sat back in her chair, overwhelmed. "So what do I do with this?" Hayes didn't blink. "You go public." Imani stiffened. "I already tried. The Crimson shut me down. The Reddit thread destroyed my name. My grant's under review. My job's gone. And they're framing me as some radical plan." "Then burn the bridge."
What? Burn it, he repeated.
"Post everything. Not to please them. Not to win. To document. To hold history accountable. You're not here to survive Harvard. You're here to expose it." She hesitated, staring at the folder again. "But if I do this," she said slowly, "they'll come harder. I'll lose everything." Hayes leaned in. "Then make it count." Imani left the cafe with the folder zipped inside her coat. The air outside had turned colder. She kept walking until she reached a bench in the yard. The same spot where Eleanor had once sat, according to a note in one of the memos. She pulled out her phone, opened her camera, took a deep breath, and hit record. Her voice trembled at first but soon steadied. "My name is Imani Carter," she said, "and this is the story Harvard tried to bury." She spoke for 7 minutes. About Eleanor, about the expulsion, about the memos, about being followed, locked out, flagged as a threat for daring to tell the truth. She ended it with a sentence she never planned. "I'm not the first Carter they tried to silence. But I will be the last." She uploaded the video to Twitter, Instagram and YouTube, tagged the university, linked the documents, pressed send. 20 minutes later, her phone began vibrating non-stop. Not with likes, but with texts. One from an unknown number read, "You don't know what you've started. They're coming for everything." Imani's laptop screen glowed like a beacon against the darkness of her dorm room. There she sat, bleary-eyed and breathless, fingers trembling as she refreshed the view count under her video. What began as a simple act of telling the truth had exploded into something larger, uncontainable. At 2:00 a.m., the counter ticked past 200,000 views. At 8:00 a.m., it hit 800,000. By noon, she couldn't keep up with the numbers surging into the millions. Her phone buzzed without pause. Alerts chimed. Messages flooded in. Notifications multiplied like echoes in a canyon. Some were supportive. Alumni from other universities reaching out. Survivors of discrimination sharing stories. Journalists requesting interviews. Others were venomous. Trolls and commentators lacing the comments with crude insults, racist jabs, accusations of fraud and entitlement. And then, the media. She had seen it coming. The local outlets, the student podcasts. What she hadn't expected was how quickly the national stage would ignite. Her parents called. Her uncle called. Her mother's voice. Her voice cracked when she said, "Fox News called you a race baiter." The accusation wasn't subtle. Jussie Smollett, one anchor sneered. Endorsed by social media. Another host suggested she was manufacturing grievance. Imani's face, calm yet fierce in her shot, became the symbol of everything from DA gone too far to whiny kids ruining academia. Her stomach dropped when her primary email lit up with forwarded threats. The screen flooded with postings revealing her parents' address, phone number, even a blurred image of their front door. She stared, unmoving, as the realization crashed down. They had gone there. Emotion rippled through her. Fear sharp, visceral, but also something else. A hot, unwavering clarity. She had struck a nerve. The institution, her community, had responded with darkness. And yet somewhere within that chaos, the truth pulsed, unstoppable. Later that afternoon, the campus pulsed too, but in a different rhythm. Security had ramped up. Uniformed guards stood at entrances. Plainclothes officers circulated through dining halls. Notices went out. Harassment on campus would not be tolerated. But there was an unmistakable undertone. Harvard spoke of protecting reputation, not protecting her. A university press statement followed. It was a masterpiece of neutral language. Harvard values a commitment to equity and rigorous examination of history. We are reviewing the allegations laid out in Ms. Carter's video. Until such time as investigation concludes, we ask the campus community to remain respectful and considerate. The statement did not deny the claims. It did not condemn her. It just held the silence. Imani read it twice. The coldness cut deeper than hate. She hadn't bought this moment for consensus or gratitude. She wanted justice. She wanted acknowledgement. Yet the campus world seemed distant. In the dining hall, whispers followed her everywhere. When she entered, conversations trailed off. Food on trays grew cold. Chairs slid back inconspicuously. Eyes darted between her and the exit. It was social abandonment. Refined. Madeline walked past without a glance. Not one word. The absence stung like betrayal. Imani wondered, was Madeline protecting their families? Did this cord run deeper than roommate conflict? By evening, her phone glowed with more notifications. A student newspaper at Yale had posted a thread supporting her claims. A retired professor from Harvard's history department, under pseudonym, confirmed the existence of internal files documenting the Carter expulsion. And somewhere in the background, a grassroots petition was gaining steam, demanding formal acknowledgement of Eleanor's story, institutional apology, and rescindment of charges against Imani. Thousands signed. Thousands more watched. Yet in the storm, not all hail fell on her. Hatred too. Racist trolls quickly targeted her with epithets, threats, even death wishes. A flood of messages crept through her phone with cruel precision. The most vicious were personal. Messages about her parents, violent threats, rumors spun about her intentions. She contacted campus security again. "Hackers are posting personal data," she said, voice tight. "My parents live here in Cambridge. Please." "There's little we can do," the officer said, offhand. "Lay low. Avoid public visibility." She hung up, jaw clenched. Lay low, as if truth ever bows to comfort. That night, one class remained on her schedule, a nighttime lecture in sociology. She walked into the near-empty classroom, arms wrapped tight around herself, shoulders tense like springs. The professor adjusted his notes and moved on, never acknowledging her presence beyond a dusty good evening. At 10:30 p.m., as she exited the building, under dim lights, something prickled her senses. Footsteps slid into sync with hers. A presence in the periphery. She quickened her pace. So did they. She cut through shaded arches where shadows reached long and deep. She pretended to look at her phone for directions, but the screen was recording. capturing dark movement that blurred behind her. She ducked into a side corridor lined with granite. Cold. The footsteps paused. Imani stilled. Her heart thundered against her ribs. A voice, soft but menacing, whispered in the dark. "You're not supposed to know what you know." She spun, but no one stood there. She broke out running. Fast. Down the walk, past the dorms, until she burst into the safety of her room, locking the door smartly, breathing so hard she could taste it. Phone still recording. She watched, but the footage played back corrupted. Static. Flicker. Then one chilling final frame. "Stay silent or the next Carter disappears too." Her knees buckled. It wasn't a threat about her. It was a threat about legacy, heritage, the enduring existence of her family's memory. Imani pressed herself to the wall, phone in hand, breath ragged, mind racing. The internet had given her voice, and now it had given her a target. She touched Eleanor's photo on the wall. The woman she had just defended, and who had once been railroaded into exile, was staring up at her with quiet courage. Imani pressed her lips together, voice choking inside her chest. They wanted to break her, make her regret. But in that terrifying moment, a fierce light ignited inside her. She would not disappear. Almost mechanically, her laptop dinged with a dangerous prompt. Live court hearing scheduled. Harvard versus Carter. What court? What hearing? Was this still internal, or something summoned by a higher power? Imani stared at the flashing notification, fear and resolve colliding. Because the next chapter was unfolding fast, and in real time. By the third day, the campus no longer felt like Harvard. It felt like something colder, tighter, heavier. Student groups had begun organizing, building momentum like a slow-burn fuse inching toward a powder keg. The Carter video had opened a wound far deeper than even Imani anticipated. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about what Harvard refused to confront. Its history, its silence, its selective memory. Flyers appeared across campus. Carter was here. Justice for Eleanor. Safety for Imani. Accountability for Harvard. Students gathered on stairwells, outside classrooms, whispering plans between lectures, heads close together. A protest was inevitable. They chose Thursday night. A peaceful demonstration. No march. No blocking entrances. Just a silent sit-in at the Harvard yard. Flashlights held high, illuminating the names of past Black alumni whose stories had never been told. Imani hadn't planned to speak. She didn't even want to be seen. But she knew she had to be there. 2 hours before the protest, the university released a statement. Carefully worded, vaguely threatening. In light of recent tensions, all unsanctioned gatherings on campus are temporarily restricted due to safety concerns. Students are urged to refrain from public demonstrations until further notice. That same day, the administration approved a film screening on the quad and a lacrosse tailgate across the river. Imani read the notice twice, her fingers curling. Restricted. For some, she arrived at the protest just before 8. Hundreds had already gathered, sitting cross-legged on the grass in the center of the yard. Flashlights shimmered across the crowd, like small fires. Some students held signs, "Erase the lies, not the legacy." Harvard, say her name. Imani stood at the edge for a long moment. In her chest, nerves twisted into knots. What if they were waiting for her? What if this was a trap? But then she saw a sophomore from her public policy class nod at her. A senior from the Black Students' Union gave her a thumbs up. Someone began chanting softly. Carter was here. Another voice joined in. Soon the chant rippled, then swelled. She stepped forward. Her classmates made a space for her at the center, forming a quiet circle. She didn't need a microphone. Not that night. She took a breath. "I wasn't supposed to be here tonight," she began, voice shaking. "Harvard didn't want me to be here at all. Not in these archives. Not in these halls. And certainly not in this moment." The crowd hushed. "I found the story of a woman who was erased. A woman who stood in this yard, like us, decades ago. Her name was Eleanor Carter. She was expelled for telling the truth. And when I tried to tell that truth, they threatened me too." She paused. "I was told I made people uncomfortable, that I should stay quiet, that my belonging here was conditional. But I'm here to tell you something. Silence protects power, not peace." Cheers rippled gently, but respectfully. She raised her voice slightly. "Eleanor's story isn't just a relic. It's a warning, a mirror, and I won't let them rewrite it again." There was a moment of stillness, a collective breath. Then, Flashlights raised. Hundreds of them. Imani looked out at the lights glowing in defiance, her throat catching. And then, like thunder breaking over glass, sirens. Police. From the east side of the yard, flashing red and blue lights, sliced through the shadows. Uniformed officers pushed into the crowd, voices loud, commands blunt. This is an unauthorized gathering. Disperse immediately. Confusion swept the protest like a wave. Some students began backing up, unsure. Others stood firm. Imani remained at the center. Frozen. Officers moved faster now, separating clusters of students, stepping over signs, shouting warnings, and then without warning, tear gas. A pop. A hiss. A scream. Gas canisters landed near the fountain. The air turned acidic, eyes burning, lungs tight. Students scattered in chaos, blinded and coughing. Imani stumbled back, the world spinning, voices distorted. She turned toward the nearest path, trying to escape, but a heavy arm grabbed her by the shoulder. Get on the ground, a voice barked behind her. No, someone yelled. She didn't do anything. Imani dropped to her knees, coughing violently, hands raised in surrender. Through watery vision, she saw blue gloves clamp around her wrists, plastic zip ties locked. A student's camera phone caught the moment. Imani face turned to the side, dirt on her cheek, a flashlight still glowing in her hand. As she was led away, head pounding, vision blurred, she looked back, and in the haze, standing beside a police van, she swore she saw Madeline Burke watching and smiling. The coldness hit her first. Concrete, metal, fluorescent lights that never dimmed, and a silence that wasn't really silence, just the hum of cameras watching every move, every breath. Imani Carter, 19, scholarship student, legacy of a buried truth, was now inmate 82-107 for the night. No charges formally filed, just holding for questioning after an unauthorized gathering spiraled out of control. They took her phone, her hoodie, even her shoelaces. The holding cell smelled like bleach and hopelessness. Two women sat silently across from her, eyes avoiding contact. One tapped her foot to a rhythm only she could hear. The other stared at the corner, unmoving, lips pressed tight. Imani pulled her knees close to her chest, her back against the wall. Her eyes were swollen from the tear gas, but she didn't cry. Not he. 18 hours. That's how long they held her. No food, no explanation, no lawyer. She asked, repeatedly, "Can I call my parents?" Later. "Can I speak to a university representative?" Later. "I'm not even charged with anything. Sit down." The officers weren't violent. They didn't need to be. Their weapon was indifference. A shrug here, a laugh there, a statement casually entered into her temporary file. Subject resisted verbal instruction. Non-compliant during detainment. It wasn't true. But the system didn't care about truth. It never had. She remembered Eleanor's file, how it had used words like defiant, uncooperative, hostile in tone. Now, 63 years later, those same shadows were following her, circling her name. By the 12th hour, her skin itched from the cold. Her body ached from sitting on a bench, meant to punish, not rest. The guards rotated, but the energy never changed. Finally, at hour 17, an older black woman entered the station with a briefcase and a tired but urgent look. "I'm her counsel," she said to the front desk. "Where's Miss Carter?" It was the first time anyone had said her name all day. Her name. Not her ID number. Not the protest girl. Not the student making trouble. The woman introduced herself as attorney Sylvia Morrow, a Boston-based civil rights lawyer with a quiet voice and a spine of iron. "They didn't process you correctly," she said as she sat beside Imani in a makeshift interview room. "You should have been released within 6 hours. There's no cause to hold you, no charge to stick, and yet, here we are." Imani swallowed hard. "How did you find out?" Sylvia offered a thin smile. "The entire internet knows where you are, sweetheart. You're not invisible anymore." Her release was expedited after that, but not without scars. Her university record had been updated. A note now appeared in her profile. Incident, non-compliance during university-adjacent police response. Under internal review. She stared at the screen in disbelief. "They put it in my file," she whispered. "They made it official." "Correction," Sylvia said.
They think they did.
That afternoon, the tide began to shift. Social media flooded with footage of the protest. Students running, gas canisters hissing, zip ties clicking shut. One video clearly showed Imani complying with officers, her hands raised. Another showed her being led away while asking for clarification, calmly and clearly. The backlash hit Harvard's administration like a wave crashing through stained glass. Justice for Imani trended globally. Alumni groups began issuing open letters, demanding a formal apology. Faculty members quietly passed around drafts of resignation threats. Even the Harvard Black Alumni Network called for an emergency meeting. Still, the university remained silent. Then, the New York Times ran a front-page story. A legacy buried, one student's fight against silence at America's oldest university. Imani's face red, swollen from gas, handcuffed in the shadows of Harvard's administrative building, became a symbol not just of a broken system, but of the lie of meritocracy. As the pressure mounted, so did the danger. Troll accounts grew bolder. Anonymous messages resumed. Threats became more specific. Photos of her home in Chicago, mentions of her mother's workplace. Even racial slurs painted on a bulletin board outside her dorm the night she returned. The school offered her a room change. Not protection, not justice. A transfer of burden, wrapped as support. Imani declined. "I won't be hidden," she said to Sylvia. "You shouldn't have to be," Sylvia replied. That night she opened the notebook she used to write in during her first semester, the one she'd filled with dreams, class notes, scholarship deadlines. The pages had shifted now, covered in quotes from Eleanor, notes from Julian Hayes, names of students who stood with her. And tucked between the pages, a letter. It hadn't been there before. The envelope was aged, the edges curled, yellowed slightly with time. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably real, cursive, elegant, deliberate. To the one who comes next. Imani's breath caught in her throat. She opened it slowly, hands shaking. Inside was a single page, inked by hand.
If you're reading this, it means they failed to keep it buried.
"I don't know your name, but I know your heart. This place broke me. Not all at once. Quietly. Strategically. They erased my voice with papers and signatures. But if you found me, if you're still standing, then I didn't vanish. I became your shadow. Use my story, but make it roar. The walls they built were not built for truth. Break them anyway." Imani Carter. Imani read it once. Then again. Then she wept. Not just for herself. Not just for Eleanor. But for every black student who'd ever been told they were only here because someone else allowed them to be. Every woman silenced in classrooms. Every voice doubted because it spoke too clearly, too loudly, too unapologetically. Eleanor had written to a ghost she believed might never exist. But she did exist. She was Imani. And she wasn't finished. That evening, as Imani read the letter one last time, her inbox pinged. A new message. No subject, no sender. Inside, one sentence. "The committee is calling you to testify." The letter stayed on Imani's desk like it was alive. She hadn't slept. Not really. She'd laid there in a daze, watching shadows crawl across the ceiling, replaying Eleanor's words like a prayer. It felt impossible, this letter surviving, waiting, finding her now. But something about the ink, the paper, the tone, it was unmistakably authentic. Eleanor had written not to a family member, but to a future, a person she believed might pick up where she was forced to stop. To Imani, it felt less like history and more like inheritance. By morning, she made a decision. The campus was still reeling from the protest fallout, and the administration's vague response had only intensified the scrutiny. Imani knew another press release wouldn't change the stakes, but Eleanor's letter might. She emailed Professor Julian Hayes and attorney Sylvia Morrow, letting them know what she intended to do. "This isn't strategy," she wrote. "It's memory. It belongs to all of us now." That night, just after 7 p.m., she went live. She didn't wear makeup, didn't rehearse. She sat in her room, the Harvard crest barely visible in the corner of her bookshelf, the yellowed envelope in her hands. "My name is Imani Carter," she began. "And tonight I'm going to read a letter written over 60 years ago by Imani Carter, my great-aunt, and the woman this university tried to erase." Over 300,000 people tuned in within the first 10 minutes. By the hour mark, over 5 million viewers were watching. She unfolded the letter with care. To the one who comes next. "I don't know your name. I don't know if Harvard has changed. I hope it has. But if it hasn't, if the cold marble still holds the same quiet judgment, then I write this to you." The woman standing in fire. I walked these halls as if I were invisible, until I became too visible. They said I spoke too confidently, that I was too angry,
That I made people uncomfortable.
I was 19. All I wanted was to learn.
They didn't just expel me.
They deleted me. But let me be clear. I was not broken. I left with a spine, with purpose, with the hope that someone like you would find my name again and speak it like a drum. To you, whoever you are, I give what they tried to bury: truth, memory, and the right to belong without apology. You are not alone. Keep walking. Imani read the last line through tears. The chat exploded. Comments flooding in from students, parents, alumni, historians, and strangers around the world. This is what bravery looks like. They tried to silence a legacy. It just got louder. Harvard must respond. Carter was here. Within 24 hours, the school's tone changed. The dean of students issued a statement acknowledging the historical records Imani had uncovered. The administration announced a review panel into racial bias in past disciplinary actions. More importantly, they reversed Imani's suspension. She was reinstated. Technically, but there was a catch. Buried in her digital file, under the Conduct Review tab, one sentence remained. Student noted as a pattern disruptor due to continued public controversy. Disruptor. The word tasted like rot in her mouth. She forwarded a screenshot to Sylvia. This isn't over, Sylvia responded. Not by a long shot. Imani stepped outside into the yard for the first time in days. Students she didn't know greeted her quietly. Some nodded. A few mouthed thank you. Others simply moved aside respectfully, as she passed, as if she carried not just history, but consequence. At the library steps, Julian Hayes was waiting. They called a faculty emergency session, he said. 2 departments want to nominate Eleanor for posthumous recognition. Another wants a memorial grant in her name. Imani nodded, barely able to smile. That's good, she said. But what about the stain in my file? That's where Sylvia comes in, he said, handing her a folded document. This dropped this morning. Thought you should see it first. She opened it slowly. It was a civil court filing. Bold, clean, and scathing. Carter v. the President and Fellows of Harvard College et al. Filed class action complaint for systemic educational discrimination and institutional retaliation. Lead plaintiff, Imani Carter. Additional plaintiffs, names redacted. Imani stared at it in stunned silence. This isn't just about you, Julian said. It's about every name they never let rise. And it's going to get messy. I'm not scared, she whispered. He looked at her. I know, he said. But they are. That night, as she placed Eleanor's letter back in her drawer, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find a courier, holding an envelope. Inside, an unsigned note. You're not the only Carter they buried. Dig deeper. The courthouse didn't feel like a place for justice. It felt clinical. Sculpted. Designed for procedure, not truth. As Imani sat behind the plaintiff's table, flanked by her attorney Sylvia Morrow, and surrounded by legal pads, scanned documents, and copies of Eleanor's letter, she realized that this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just another beginning. Another arena where legacy had its own playbook, and she had only memory and principle. The room was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, laptops glowing. The front rows were lined with observers, many wearing quiet buttons that read, Carter was here. And directly across the room sat Harvard's legal team. Suits sharp as scalpels, faces unreadable. Randall Burke was there too, seated behind the defense, as if this courtroom was just another boardroom he expected to control. Imani didn't look at him. She focused on the judge, Claire Barlow, a woman known for her strict adherence to facts and her intolerance for theatrics. That gave Imani hope, but not comfort. The case Carter v. Harvard was unprecedented. A civil action alleging institutional retaliation, systemic racial bias in academic processes, and obstruction of historical truth. Sylvia had fought to keep it from being dismissed outright, and after public outcry, the court agreed to hear it. The evidence would be ugly. The defense would be brutal. Day 1 began with the laying of groundwork. Sylvia opened with precision. Your Honor, this is not a case about one student's misconduct. It's about the culture that made misconduct the institution's response to truth. Then she walked the court through a timeline. Eleanor Carter's enrollment. The sudden plagiarism accusation. Her expulsion without hearing or appeal. The hidden archive file. Imani's discovery. Suspension. Public shaming. The coordinated attempt to discredit her online. the administrative decision to label her a disruptor, even after reinstatement. She ended with a pause. Your Honor, when legacy becomes a shield for silence, justice has no place. We're here to make space for it. Harvard's opening statement struck a different chord. They painted Imani as ambitious, well-intentioned, but impulsive. Their counsel, a man named Leonard Greaves, argued that while the university regretted historical injustices, decisions made in the 1960s must be understood in the context of the times. Imani's stomach turned. He went on to question the motives behind the sudden publicity, suggesting that the viral video placed enormous and undue pressure on the institution to respond hastily. And then, with a subtle but sharp jab, there is no evidence Eleanor Carter was expelled on racial grounds. We only have a student's interpretation of incomplete documents. That was how they would play it. Undermine, diminish, reframe. Over the following days, Sylvia called a series of witnesses, Black alumni from across 5 decades, each with stories that mirrored Eleanor's and echoed Imani's. Small humiliations, dismissed complaints, careers that stalled in silence. One former student from the class of 1983 described having her thesis delayed after mentioning systemic racism in Harvard's founding history. Another, class of 1998, testified that she was encouraged to switch from political science to something less confrontational. Each story didn't just add weight, it built a pattern. But Harvard pushed back with equal force. They brought in faculty who denied bias, former deans who claimed no memory of key meetings, trustees who praised the institution's evolving diversity programs. Then came Imani's turn. She stood in front of the courtroom, with a calm forged in fire. Sylvia guided her carefully. Ms. Carter, why did you access the restricted archive? Because I found a reference to Eleanor Carter in a sealed section. Her story wasn't public. She's my great-aunt. I needed to know why her name was erased. You found documentation? Yes. Memos, letters, even a note recommending her expulsion be expedited due to disruption. And what happened after you shared your findings? I was suspended. My keycard was disabled. Rumors spread. A Reddit post accused me of being an affirmative action fraud. I received threats. My parents' home was doxxed. Her voice remained steady, but her hands resting on the rail shook ever so slightly. Did anyone from Harvard ever apologize? Not once. Thank you, Miss Carter. Then Greaves approached. He moved like a man confident he was in control. Miss Carter, he began. You're aware that the archive you accessed was restricted for a reason. Yes. And yet you entered anyway. Yes. Isn't it true that your essay was flagged for advanced composition concerns even before the archive incident? It was flagged without basis. Wasn't your rise to attention convenient for a student seeking to make an impact in the policy world? I didn't ask for attention. I asked for truth. Greaves tilted his head. Is it possible, Miss Carter, that your connection to Eleanor Carter is influencing your objectivity? Imani looked straight at him. She's the reason I'm objective. Without her, I'd still believe this place wanted me to succeed. The courtroom stirred. Greaves returned to his seat, jaw tight. Judge Barlow adjusted her glasses. Defense, do you have another witness? Greaves hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Douglas Whitmore to the stand. Miana's heart slammed against her ribs. Whitmore, the same director of student affairs who caught her in the archive that night. The man who stood silently as campus police removed her. The man who once held Eleanor's file in his hands and said nothing. He took the stand with weary poise. Greaves approached him gently. Mr. Whitmore, how long have you worked for the university? 17 years. Have you ever seen institutional misconduct against a student of color? A pause. I've seen patterns, Whitmore said, but nothing as overt as what happened with Miss Carter. Imani tensed. Greaves blinked. Excuse me? Whitmore turned toward the judge. Your Honor, may I speak freely? Judge Barlow leaned forward. You may. Whitmore looked at Imani. I was there the night she found the file. I read it. I saw what it contained, and I stayed silent. The courtroom froze. I was afraid of what it meant, afraid of what it would cost. But after reading Eleanor's name and seeing Imani's face, I couldn't unknow it. The university has protected its reputation over truth for decades, and I'm done protecting it. A murmur swept the room as Whitmore reached into his coat and placed a sealed envelope on the stand. I never submitted this, he said. It's Eleanor Carter's original expulsion hearing transcript, unsigned, unfiled, and unread, until now. The courtroom was silent in that heavy, expectant way, like the final breath before a storm lands. After weeks of testimonies, documents, late-night headlines, and carefully constructed doubt, it all came down to this moment. 12 jurors, one piece of paper, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Imani Carter sat still, back straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. On the outside she was composed. Inside, every nerve was a live wire. Sylvia Morrow sat beside her, her seasoned calm unshaken, her eyes fixed on the judge. To Imani's left was a fold inside it, Eleanor's letter, still creased at the edges from so many readings, still a heartbeat in ink. The jury foreperson stood, a short woman with silver hair and wide, knowing eyes. Her hands didn't tremble, not visibly. She passed the folded verdict to the bailiff, who carried it to Judge Claire Barlow, presiding with the gravity of someone who knew she was witnessing history. Judge Barlow unfolded the page and read silently. Then her voice rang clear through the still air. In the matter of Carter v. the President and Fellows of Harvard College, regarding historical racial discrimination, retaliation, and institutional misconduct, we, the jury, find the defendant, Harvard University, liable. There was a beat of pure, stunned silence.
Then it cracked.
Gasps, stifled sobs. A murmur building, like rising water. Imani didn't move at first. It took her a full moment to process the word. Liable. Not ambiguous. Not under review. Not academic. Not cautious. Just true. The judge continued. We also find the defendant liable for present-day retaliatory conduct against the plaintiff, Ms. Imani Carter, including wrongful suspension, administrative labeling, and failure to provide institutional protection following threats of harm. We recommend the following. A public acknowledgement of harm. The removal of retaliatory notations from Ms. Carter's record. Reparative funding toward historically excluded students. And the establishment of a memorial and foundation in the name of Eleanor Carter. Imani finally exhaled. Shakily, deeply, like a weight she hadn't fully understood had been lifted from her ribs. She turned to Sylvia, whose jaw had tightened, eyes shining but proud. You did it, she whispered. Sylvia shook her head. We did it. On the other side of the courtroom, Harvard's legal team sat like statues, elegant, polished, and wounded. Their lead attorney, Leonard Greaves, blinked slowly, already recalculating his next move. Behind them, Randall Burke, trustee, father of Madeline, enforcer of silence, stood and exited without a word. He didn't glance at Imani. Didn't have to. She'd taken something from him he thought he could never lose control. Outside the courthouse, the world had already shifted. A crowd had gathered. Students, alumni, activists, journalists, and everyday people. Some held signs. Others held each other. News anchors delivered breaking headlines while drones circled above, capturing the images for history. When Imani stepped out onto the stone steps, flashbulbs exploded. She blinked into the light. This time, it didn't feel like interrogation. It felt like affirmation. Julian Hayes met her at the bottom, placing a hand on her shoulder. You changed the record, he said quietly. No, Imani replied, voice still catching. I restored it. Within days, Harvard released an official statement. It was direct. No hedging, no softening. The tone was different from past PR attempts. The court had left no room for reinterpretation. We acknowledge that Eleanor Carter was wrongfully expelled from Harvard University in 1962 due to her political activism and race. We regret our actions and the harm that followed, including the retaliation faced by her great-niece, Imani Carter. Effective immediately, we are establishing the Eleanor Carter Legacy Foundation, dedicated to archival equity, historical repair, and the elevation of underrepresented voices in academia. The President and Fellows of Harvard College. The response was met with cautious applause. For some, it came too late. For others, it marked a beginning. But for Imani, it was complicated. She watched the same institution that once labeled her a disruption now hail her as a trailblazer. Donors who once quietly pressured the board now released statements of support. Professors who had gone silent during her suspension now posted tributes to her courage. The whiplash was dizzying. A week later, she met with the foundation's interim board. They offered her a formal seat, a stipend, a new research role, a potential speaking tour. You can help us lead this forward, the chairwoman had said. Imani nodded politely, listening carefully. She didn't answer right away. Afterward, she walked through Harvard Yard alone. Spring had begun to soften the landscape. Cherry blossoms hung from trees like pink lanterns. Students sprawled on the grass, headphones in, laughter floating across the open space. It looked like any other day. But for her, nothing was the same. She passed by a group of first-year students, discussing a sociology reading. One of them turned as she passed, eyes lighting with recognition. "Are you?" Imani smiled faintly. "Yeah, that's me." The student smiled back. "Thank you." That word, "thank you," had come more times than she could count in the past week, from black students, from children of activists, from women who had once been told to quiet their voices. But inside, Imani still wrestled with the ache that never left, because Eleanor wasn't here. And neither were the dozens, maybe hundreds, who had been quietly removed, redirected, erased before Harvard ever cared to ask their names. One evening, she received an envelope. No stamp, no sender. Inside was a short, handwritten message. "You were never meant to win this. But now that you have, ask yourself if you still belong." She stared at it a long time. It didn't frighten her, not like before. But it reminded her, even after victory, resistance lingered. The ceremony came a month later. The Eleanor M. Carter Memorial Plaque was unveiled during a twilight gathering outside the university archives. Press attended, faculty, former students, the president of the university. It was somber, reverent, carefully choreographed. Imani was the keynote speaker. She stood at the podium, with the plaque behind her, bronze letters etched in permanence. Eleanor M. Carter, 19, advocate, scholar, silenced, but never forgotten. Imani looked at the crowd, faces young and old, black and brown and white. She took a breath. 1 year ago, I was dragged out of this yard in handcuffs for accessing a file that belonged to my family, to my history, to a truth Harvard wanted hidden. She paused. That night, I thought I was alone, but I wasn't. Eleanor had left a light on for me. And now we leave that light on for everyone who comes next. There was a hush, a power in the stillness. She ended with the same words Eleanor had written in her letter. "Let no truth be buried." The crowd stood in silence as the cloth dropped from the plaque. Some clapped. Others cried. That night, Imani boarded a quiet commuter train and traveled just outside the city. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. This visit wasn't for She arrived at the cemetery just after sundown. The headstone stood as it always had. Simple, weathered, elegant. She walked ahead so others could follow. Imani knelt in the grass. "Thank you," she whispered. She pulled a folded copy of the verdict from her coat and placed it beneath the small bouquet of lilies she'd brought. "I got them to listen. Just like you wanted." She didn't cry. Not because she wasn't moved, but because the ache had changed. It was no longer heavy with grief. It was charged with purpose. She stood and turned to go, but her eyes fell on the headstone beside Eleanor's. The one with no birth date, no inscription, just the name, Lal Carter. A mystery. A signal. Had there been another? Was Eleanor only part of a wider silence? The thought burrowed deep, pulling at her curiosity. That night, back in her apartment, Imani opened her email. One new message. No subject, no body, just an attachment. She clicked. Inside was a scanned photo from a black woman, arms crossed, standing in front of a Harvard building. The caption beneath, Lena Carter, first denied, never enrolled, never documented. Imani stared at the screen, pulse quickening. Another Carter. Another story. And the truth, it seemed, was still waiting. The campus looked different at night. Not because of the buildings. Those were the same, proud and ancient, but because of the air, the way it moved, the way it held memory. It had been a year since Imani Carter first stood beneath the Gothic arches of Harvard's archive building, heart pounding, hands trembling, folder in hand, not knowing what she was stepping into. Now, she stood there again. This time it was 2 a.m. by ceremony, not by fear. Floodlights cast a warm glow across the newly renovated courtyard. A small crowd had gathered. Even at this late hour, faculty, students, alumni, and a few reporters. The moment was symbolic, deliberate. 1 year to the hour since she had been detained for seeking the truth. And tonight, she was here to unveil it. At the base of the building's eastern wall, covered by a crimson cloth, stood a brass plaque. Clean, heavy, permanent. Imani stood before it, a microphone in hand, her voice carried by soft speakers set across the cobblestones. She looked over the crowd and took a breath. "I didn't come to Harvard to make history," she began. "I came to learn it." A pause. "I thought I would be walking into a place that honored every voice that helped shape it. But I found out some names had been buried. Some voices erased." She turned slightly, gesturing to the plaque. Eleanor Carter was one of those voices. She was a student here in 1962. She was brilliant, outspoken, principled. She stood against injustice, and Harvard erased her for it. Imani let the words hang. "But here's the thing about truth. It echoes, even when the walls try to silence it." There was a hum of quiet acknowledgement from the crowd. She continued, "Tonight we don't just honor Eleanor. We honor every student who was told to be quieter, smaller, more grateful. Every person who was marked disruptive for speaking clearly. Every name lost in the cracks of selective memory." She scanned the crowd again. Her eyes landed on a familiar figure. Douglas Whitmore, the former director of student affairs, stood at the back. No longer in a suit. No longer in power. Just a man, watching silently. She didn't nod to him. Didn't look away either. Somewhere near him stood Professor Julian Hayes, arms folded, expression unreadable but proud. Imani returned her focus to the plaque. "I once found this building in the dark, searching for answers. Tonight we install this plaque so no one has to search again." She paused. Her fingers tightened around the mic. And as Eleanor once wrote, in the letter she left behind, her voice wavered, but didn't break. "Let no truth be buried." The crowd fell into silence. As the cloth was pulled away, the plaque shone gold in the floodlights. The engraved words read, "In memory of Eleanor M. Carter, student, advocate, erased, but never forgotten. This archive is rededicated, in her name and in honor of all Black pioneers in American higher education, who faced silence but chose voice. Harvard University Archives Committee." A few people clapped. Some cried. Others just stood there, heads bowed. Imani stepped back from the mic, heart thudding, not from nerves but from release. One by one, the crowd dispersed. Some came to shake her hand. Some said nothing at all. Julian squeezed her shoulder gently. A first-year Black student approached her with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I stayed because of you." Eventually, the courtyard emptied. Imani remained. The floodlights clicked off, leaving only the soft halo of lamplight and moon. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small card. Her new ID, staff, not student, title, research fellow in historical equity and archival integrity. They had offered her a position, not out of guilt but because she'd made space where silence once lived. And she'd said yes, but not to belong, to preserve, to protect the stories no one else would. She stepped toward the door of the archive, the same one she'd once entered illegally. She scanned her card. The lock clicked. Inside, the halls were quiet. She walked down the same path, past the same shelves, now reorganized, curated, accurate. She reached the Eleanor Carter collection, now digitized, indexed, fully available to the public. It shared a space with records from other overlooked figures, dismissed, expelled, redacted, no longer invisible. Imani placed her hand on the metal drawer. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned to the far corner, where a desk had been placed beneath a window, her new workspace. She sat down, pulled open her laptop, and began cataloging a new box labeled L. Carter, pending verification. The one she'd found at the grave. A second erasure, another truth. The work wasn't over, but she was no longer trespassing. She was the keeper now. The camera would fade out, not with applause or headlines but with Imani walking deeper into the archives, key in hand, light trailing behind her, ready to unbury the next name. If you've ever been made to feel small for simply existing, if you've ever watched the truth get buried because it made powerful people uncomfortable, then you know this story isn't just about Imani. It's about all of us. Type yes if you believe buried truths deserve light. Subscribe if this broke your heart, but lit a fire.